Due to a growing conversation about sexual violence on college and now high school campuses, this conversation led by survivors of sexual violence, a lot of people in a lot of different communities are starting to ask a lot of questions about how we can be there for those who survive this human rights violation within our community. And that brings up a lot of important questions about how to have a proper response, how to make sure that the survivor is comfortable, and how to make sure that as best we can seek justice for them. And then the next logical question after that is, how do we stop this from happening before it happens? How can we prevent it? And usually when we think about preventing this sexual violence, the conversation goes to sexual consent. What can we do to promote a healthy idea of sexual consent? How can we make the idea of healthy consent cool? How can we model positive behaviors around consent for our youth to engage in this message and understand it clearly? And so I still remember 3 years ago getting my first call. I was 21 years old, and I was still a senior in undergrad in college. And I remember getting my first call asking me to take my theories and ideas that I had been implementing through Party with Consent on my own campus to another campus. And those theories around healthy masculinities promotion, sexual violence prevention, and in a broader way, movement building. And I was so thrilled. My heart was pounding. I don't really remember a lot that was happening on that conversation. But towards the end of it, I remember somebody on the other end, it was a conference call, said something that gave me a little bit of pause. Said, given the conversation on our campus about sexual violence, we are so excited to bring in a consent educator. I paused in my head and I thought, consent educator? What is that? And so I obviously got back on the call and said, oh, yeah, like, I got it, yeah. Totally, I can be that for you. But when I got off the call, I started to reflect. And I never remember being called a consent educator before. And so I found it really important for me to begin just a deeper reflection on how did I learn about sexual consent in the first place? If I'm an educator on this now, I really have to know what I'm talking about. So where did I learn this in the first place? So a lot of people start to prompt this conversation with, doesn't this conversation happen in the home? When I talked to some of my friends about this conversation over lunch, as bizarre as that sounds, I did have this conversation with some friends over lunch. And I started to ask, where did you all think that this conversation was at? And the first prompt is, isn't this conversation had in the home? For me, somebody like my dad or an older man in my life would have the dreaded, awkward birds and the bees conversation. And unfortunately for me, that wasn't an opportunity that I had, because right around puberty, when I was 12 years old, my dad actually died suddenly in a car accident. And I grew up with a single mom, and for reasons that I totally understand, before I went to high school and before I went to college, she wasn't totally ready to have a conversation with me about what healthy sexual relationships were supposed to look like. So then the next prompt is, okay, so what about school? In school, you probably had sex ed courses that had something to do with sexual consent. And I thought, oh yeah, that could have been a place. But when I reflected on that, I realized that conversation had a lot more to do with the science of sex education. I remember having flashcards and memorizing parts of the body that led to a lot of jokes amongst my friends in these study groups, and memorizing the words and the proper definitions for body parts that we called things totally different. And then I remember having to memorize the way that different STDs and STIs affected different populations, different demographics, and even the idea of how to use certain contraception. All really important ideas. But the art of sexual consent, this idea, how do I actually have a conversation with somebody about having sex with them? How do I actually communicate that? I don't really remember that conversation in a classroom. I don't remember having that conversation with a teacher in front of the room. So I'm still reflecting on this idea of where did I learn this? I have to be an educator of it. There wasn't an educator in my life who was my consent educator in the way that we typically understand it. For example, When I thought of math, one of my favorite math professors, Mr. McCullough, depicted as a guy who was writing different equations on the board in front of me, or my favorite English teacher, Mrs. Larson, who dissected the difficult texts of Shakespeare with us. But for me, I never had somebody have that difficult conversation or present the themes or ideas in front of me the way those traditional educators did. So was I going into high school and college just totally ignorant to this idea of sexual consent? And as I furthered my reflections, I realized absolutely not. I was learning consent from different forms of messaging and media, both on TV and in movies and on the internet, and within groups of friends. And particularly in movies and TV shows, the idea that, for me, a young heterosexual man, that the way that you got to have sex with people was to trick or coerce or manipulate girls and young women into having sex with you, to score. That was really the education that I was getting around sexual consent, however unhealthy and toxic that it truly was. And furthermore, the most explicit form around pornography was teaching me more of those lessons around manipulation and force and even violence at times. And particularly in that example, that those were pictures, those were images created in fantasy. And to give a small analogy, if I went and saw the movie Fast and Furious, I wouldn't leave that movie thinking that that's the way that I was supposed to drive a car, right? The reason that I know that it's fantasy is because every single day I can walk outside and I can see that's the appropriate way to drive a car. But unfortunately, when we're talking about sexual consent, we don't have the same opportunity that we do with driving cars to deconstruct this fantasy around pornography. We have to sort of discuss the reality of this. Students like myself going into high school and particularly going into college have received years upon years of information on how they are supposed to act as though within their own identity. So for me, a heterosexual man is supposed to act in a certain way given the different media that I've consumed. And also that was reaffirmed by a lot of these all-male groups that I was a part of, particularly athletics. When all the coaches were gone and the parents were gone in the locker room, these ideas that were learned in unhealthy and environments that weren't feeding into sort of thinking about healthy consent, those were reaffirmed by the older guys on my team. The older guys on my team who had the experience, their word, no matter how toxic, sexist, misogynistic it was, that word was law, and it could not be disagreed with. So the reality is that we're getting these messages for years before we come into college and high school. We're getting these messages for a bit fewer years around what we're supposed to do around a conversation with sexual consent for years before, a couple years before we get to high school and a bunch of years before we get to college. So the idea of a consent educator in college is a bit naive because the reality is that these students already have a really strong idea of what this is supposed to look like. So the opportunity that I have at times to share a definition of what healthy consent looks like, I oftentimes can see how it can fall on deaf ear, go in one ear and out the other with the students that I talk to. And that doesn't have to do with the fact that they're not interested or they don't care, but rather because they have years upon years of messaging and images telling them that that is not what they're supposed to do. So for me, the opportunity that I have to start a conversation, an authentic, truthful, safe conversation around being an unhealthy consent deconstructor, to have this conversation and to meet the students where they're at, to know that they are already getting imaging and ideas about this, to ask them, how do you know what you know about this first? And to deconstruct how different forms of imaging are, as much as they feel like they're the right thing, that they are unhealthy and not fully true, and then to begin a conversation to construct what healthy consent looks like. Thank you.